It was just past 8 a.m. on a cloudless Monday morning when Dr. Sloane Hayes, a poised and sharply focused black woman in her early 40s, stepped out of a sleek black town car in front of Crestfield Dynamics' gleaming headquarters, a glass and steel monolith that stretched 20 stories into the sky, housing one of the most powerful but culturally stagnant tech conglomerates on the East Coast. She adjusted the cuffs of her charcoal blazer, shouldered her sleek leather briefcase, and walked toward the revolving doors with the quiet confidence of someone who had already rewritten the rules before the game even started. The city was waking up around her, but Sloane was already ahead, having spent her early morning reviewing the final pages of the $100 million acquisition contract she had negotiated and signed over the weekend, a deal that not only saved Crestfield from financial stagnation but launched it into a new era of global competitiveness. Today was not just a ceremonial meeting. It was her official debut as the newly appointed CEO, a role she had earned not through favors or connections but through brilliance, discipline, and a decade-long track record of transforming faltering corporations into global giants. Yet as she rode the elevator up to the executive floor, her mind replayed the years that led to this moment, the late nights studying at Wharton, the countless times she had to prove her qualifications 2 or 3 times over to people who barely gave her a second glance, the countless boardrooms where she'd been mistaken for an assistant, until she pulled out numbers and insights that silenced even the loudest men at the table. She had prepared for this morning not with rehearsed speeches, but with something stronger: receipts, results, and resolve. But even as the elevator chimed and the doors parted to reveal the elegant top floor, tastefully decorated with modern art and lined with plush cream carpet, Sloane knew the resistance would start before she even opened her mouth. What she didn't expect, though, was just how boldly it would present itself. As she walked calmly down the corridor toward the boardroom, her heels clicking softly but purposefully, she noticed a tall, broad-shouldered man step out from an adjacent office. He wore a name badge that read Tom Linton, Senior Operations Manager, and bore the confident swagger of someone used to being obeyed without question. He glanced at her, frowned subtly, then quickly positioned himself between her and the boardroom doors. "Excuse me," he said, holding up a palm as if halting a security breach. "This floor is reserved for executives. You might be on the wrong level." Sloane paused, maintaining eye contact with a calm, measured grace, and replied, "I'm exactly where I need to be. I have a meeting scheduled in that room." Tom chuckled dismissively and shook his head, leaning slightly forward. "I don't think so," he said with a condescending grin. "This is for C-level execs only. Board strategy session. Big stuff." His tone carried that polished rudeness cloaked in corporate politeness, the kind of tone that assumed women like Sloane were always one bad swipe away from the mailroom or the marketing intern desk. Sloane studied his face, her expression unreadable, then coolly reached into a briefcase and retrieved a slim, embossed folder. Before she could open it, Tom cut her off with a quick shake of his head and stepped more firmly in front of the doors. "Look," he said, "if you're here to deliver something, or you're from HR or one of the consulting firms, I can call someone to escort you to the right floor." That last line was the tipping point. Sloane slowly returned the folder to her case and stood still, allowing silence to do the heavy lifting. It stretched between them like a challenge, but Sloane wasn't flinching. She tilted her head slightly and replied, "And if I told you I am the meeting, what then?" Tom smirked, clearly amused, and tapped his security badge against the sensor near the boardroom doors as if to reinforce his position. "Ma'am," he said, with a hint of mock authority, "you're really going to need to step back. This is a high-level meeting. We don't have time for confusion." Just then, voices began rising behind the frosted glass of the boardroom. The silhouettes of suited figures moved around inside, and a moment later, the double doors swung open. Out stepped Reginald Shaw, the chairman of the board, a tall, silver-haired black man known in business circles as the architect of several multi-billion-dollar turnarounds. His eyes lit up as soon as they landed on Sloane. "Dr. Hayes," he beamed, walking swiftly past a now-frozen Tom. "Everyone's inside waiting for you. Come in, come in." Tom's face lost all color as Reginald threw a welcoming arm around Sloane's shoulder. "Gentlemen," Reginald announced to the boardroom, now visible through the open doors, "this is the woman who just delivered us a $100 million game-changer. Meet your new CEO." The room, full of powerful white and Asian male executives who had until now only known Sloane through PowerPoint decks and acquisition memos, suddenly stood at awkward attention. As she stepped into the room, the energy shifted like a storm, arriving without thunder. Some of them nodded stiffly, others blinked in disbelief, but no one spoke. Sloane walked to the head of the table and opened her briefcase with elegance, removing the finalized deal documents. She laid them on the table without a word, then finally looked back at Tom, still hovering uselessly outside the door. "Next time," she said, her voice calm but steely. "Don't assume the person you're stopping doesn't own the room." Tom tried to muster a response, but Reginald was already motioning for the doors to close. As they shut with a quiet hiss, Sloane turned to face the table. She didn't need to introduce herself again. Her presence did all the speaking, and in that boardroom where decisions shaped industries and fortunes, a new era had just begun. with a bang, but with a locked door, an arrogant man, and a black woman who knew exactly when to open it. The moment the boardroom doors closed behind Dr. Sloan Hayes, the air in the room shifted from polite formality to an undercurrent of uneasy recalibration. As the top executives of Crestfield Dynamics, some of the most pedigreed, powerful men in the tech industry, found themselves confronted not only by a change in leadership, but by a leader who defied every comfortable expectation they had built their careers around. Sloan's presence alone, with her meticulously tailored gray suit, natural coiled hair perfectly pinned, and eyes that had already measured every man at the table within seconds, was more commanding than any speech, and she wielded silence with such discipline that it made the board lean forward unconsciously. Needing her to speak before they could exhale, finally she did, unfolding the deal portfolio before her like a general unrolling a battle plan, her voice even and calm, as she walked them through the newly signed $100 million acquisition of ArcLight Systems, a move she had initiated, structured, and closed over a sleepless 3-week sprint that outmaneuvered 3 competitors and secured proprietary AI infrastructure that would catapult Crestfield past its stagnant growth rate and into dominance over 2 of its closest rivals. And yet, even as the facts poured out, data projections, signed contracts, legal approvals, Sloan could see it in their eyes, admiration grudgingly forming under the surface of pride and discomfort. The internal wrestling match of men who were now forced to admit that the woman they had assumed was a junior partner, at best, was actually 10 steps ahead of them all along. And as she finished her presentation with a firm questions, the silence that followed was thick with recalibration. Only Reginald Shaw, the board chair who had personally pushed her candidacy forward despite pushback, nodded with a faint smile, as if to say, let's see if they're ready to catch up. Finally, a hand raised. It belonged to Gordon Pierce, the CFO, a man known for his guarded skepticism and tightly controlled disdain for change, especially when that change challenged the old boys club culture he had helped nurture for over a decade. He adjusted his wire-framed glasses and asked, with the calculated tone of someone hiding condescension under corporate etiquette, Dr. Hayes, while the deal looks solid, don't you think it's a bit aggressive, considering our current cash flow forecast? Sloan smiled, not because the question surprised her, but because she had anticipated that exact phrasing. Down to the pause before aggressive. Mr. Pierce, she replied, her voice velvet with steel. What's aggressive is waiting another quarter and letting Riven Technologies patent the very system we now own. What's aggressive is expecting growth without risking anything. What I did was assertive, calculated, and in your inbox last week. If the forecast is too tight, it's because you failed to consider what innovation actually requires. The boardroom stilled. Some leaned back in their chairs. Some flicked glances at each other, and Pierce gave a stiff nod, conceding the round without admitting defeat. Over the next hour, Sloan dissected every pillar of Crestfield's operation, outlining not just the acquisition strategy, but the personnel overhauls, diversity restructuring, ESG accountability frameworks, and internal equity audits she planned to implement within the next 60 days. It wasn't just a new CEO speaking, it was a woman with a blueprint to re-engineer the company's very DNA, and the board knew it. But resistance, especially the covert kind, never vanishes, it morphs. After the meeting adjourned, as Sloan returned to her new office, a glass-walled command center once occupied by men who thought corner offices were shrines to legacy, not launchpads for revolution, she sat alone for a moment, allowing the silence to settle before opening her laptop to find a passive-aggressive email from Tom Linton, the same manager who'd blocked her entry just hours ago. The message, CC'd to several department heads, included a gentle reminder about guest protocols and executive floor access. Sloan read it once, twice, and then deleted it without replying. Instead, she made a single call to Marissa Jin, her newly appointed chief of staff, a sharp strategist with a spine of titanium and a memory like a legal brief. Marissa, Sloan said calmly, schedule a full review of middle management. I want departmental reports and conduct reviews on my desk by Friday. Start with Linton. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, and let HR know the CEO's credentials don't need verifying anymore. Over the next 72 hours, the ripple effect of Sloan's leadership began turning into waves. Departments that had once coasted on reputation were suddenly under performance scrutiny. Meetings were trimmed from bloated hours to 30-minute strategic sprints, and the old guard, those who had lounged in Crestfield's stagnant comfort, began whispering among themselves, uncertain if they could survive this storm in heels and sharp wit. But for every eye that rolled behind closed doors, 10 more watched in astonishment as Sloan handled investor calls with poise, reassured partners with facts and charisma, and turned an underwhelming Q to forecast into a media opportunity highlighting Crestfield's bold new era. Still, outside the walls of admiration, resentment brewed. Tom, especially, became a symbol of quiet rebellion, rallying a few like-minded managers to monitor Sloan's decisions, compiling a soft dossier of perceived oversteps, hoping to ignite board doubt or at least chip away at her momentum. But Sloan wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, and she had allies. not just in Reginald, but across departments where junior employees, particularly women, people of color, and the overlooked brilliant minds suddenly felt seen, respected, and heard. Whisper networks began buzzing, not with gossip, but with hope. "She's the real deal," they'd say in elevators. "She actually listens." And still, Sloane kept her posture straight, her schedule tighter, and her vision unshaken, knowing that power was never something you were handed, it was something you built with strategy, results, and patience. And now that she was in the room, no one, not a board skeptic, not a bitter manager, not even an entire institution conditioned to underestimate women like her, was going to stop her from owning every inch of it. The days that followed were not just a test of Sloane Hayes' leadership, but a trial by fire in the face of an entrenched corporate culture that had long rewarded mediocrity wrapped in privilege. And as she stepped into her third week as Crest Dynamics CEO, the battle lines were drawn not by formal opposition but by something far more insidious: passive obstruction dressed in politeness, microaggressions, master's policy questions, and a constant stream of so-called protocol reminders from middle management, attempting to assert dominance not through merit but through petty control. Tom Linton, still bristling from the humiliation of blocking Sloane from the boardroom on her first day, had now made himself the unofficial gatekeeper of resistance, using his seniority and tenure as weapons of delay, rerouting memos, losing calendar invites, and subtly undermining her directives with veiled concern about pace and cultural readiness, all the while positioning himself as a loyal steward of company legacy. What he didn't know was that Sloane had not only expected this resistance but had prepared for it years ago, having studied dozens of case studies of CEOs who looked like her: black, brilliant female who was sabotaged not by their failures but by the quiet coups of small-minded men who couldn't imagine taking orders from someone who reminded them of everything they'd never be. So, while Linton spun his webs of condescension, Sloane was building an internal revolution quietly and strategically. She elevated overlooked team leads, empowered junior analysts with decision-making autonomy, and launched a series of innovation pods across departments that bypassed traditional hierarchy entirely, allowing fresh talent to pitch directly to her office with product ideas, process improvements, and vision-driven proposals. And within 2 weeks, the results spoke louder than any memo could. Productivity surged by 18%, a stalled software prototype was revived and beta-ready, and 3 Fortune 500 partners reached out expressing renewed interest in collaborations they had previously abandoned under old leadership. Meanwhile, Linton grew increasingly agitated, watching as his influence eroded, especially after Sloane assigned his biggest account to a 27-year-old black woman named Layla from strategy. Citing Layla's sharp analysis during a late-night think tank as exactly the kind of agile intelligence this company's been starving for, he stormed into her office the next morning, voice tight with false composure, and said, "Dr. Hayes, I hope you're not setting precedents that ignore seniority and structure." To which Sloane, without lifting her eyes from the quarterly report she was reviewing, replied coolly, "I am setting a precedent, Mr. Linton, but it's one based on excellence, not ego." And the silence that followed was deafening, a moment in which the weight of his old authority crumbled quietly under the force of her unapologetic competence. Meanwhile, word began to spread beyond the company. Industry blogs, LinkedIn posts, and business podcasts started picking up on Crestfield's transformation under its new CEO, with headlines like "Tech's Quiet, Giant Finds Its Voice" and "How a Black Woman CEO is Redefining Legacy." But Sloane remained focused, unmoved by praise or noise, guided by a compass forged in adversity and a vision far larger than just making Crestfield profitable again. Her mission was deeper. It was to remake the very DNA of leadership, to shatter not just glass ceilings but the entire architecture of exclusion that made them necessary in the first place. And that mission became even more urgent when a whistleblower came forward, an anonymous tip sent to her direct inbox with encrypted attachments, detailing how Linton and a few allies were manipulating vendor contracts and suppressing day audit results to cover their years of discriminatory hiring practices, complete with falsified HR reports and backdated documentation. Sloane, unfazed but deeply disturbed, activated her legal and compliance teams. Not with fury but with surgical precision. Within 48 hours, internal audits were initiated under confidentiality clauses, and a private board meeting was scheduled, where Sloane laid out the findings with the poise of a prosecutor and the conviction of a woman who had not clawed her way to the top just to let rot fester beneath her watch. Some of the board members were stunned, others not so much, but none could deny the severity or the clarity with which she presented the case, ending with a chilling statement: "Leadership is not a title, it's an accountability, and anyone who violates this company's integrity, no matter how long they've been here, will answer for it." The board gave unanimous support for a full investigation, and the following morning Tom Linton's keycard access was revoked, his office sealed pending legal review, and a company-wide announcement was made that sent tremors across every department. Crestfield was no longer tolerating the old way of doing business, and it started at the top. What followed was not just relief but a surge of morale from staffers who had long whispered about the toxicity but never thought they'd see justice served, especially not so swiftly, especially not by someone who looked like them, who carried herself with both grace and uncompromising grit. Sloane walked through the office that day not as a figurehead but as a force, receiving nods, handshakes, quiet thank yous from employees who finally felt like the walls were being pulled down brick by brick. And as she returned to her office, she looked out across the skyline, her reflection merging with the glass, and she smiled not because the battle was over, but because the real work could finally begin now that the rot had been exposed. She picked up the phone and called her mother, the woman who had raised her on sacrifice, scripture, and strategy, and simply said, "Mama, we just cleaned house. The future's wide open." And somewhere in that moment between legacy and leadership, fire and forward motion, Dr. Sloane Hayes became not just the CEO of Crestfield Dynamics, but a symbol of what happens when excellence is no longer asked to knock politely but walks in and takes its rightful seat at the head of the table. Dr. Sloane Hayes, a brilliant and composed black woman with a PhD in economics and decades of high-level experience, arrives at Crestfield Dynamics for her first day as the new CEO, on appointment kept confidential to surprise the board. However, a dismissive manager named Tom Linton blocks her from entering the executive boardroom, assuming she's either lost or an assistant. Without causing a scene, Sloane steps back, watches, and lets the moment burn into her memory. 1 hour later, she enters the same boardroom from the CEO's private entrance, stunning the board of directors. She doesn't just command the room, she flips it, presenting a $100 million merger deal with a tech company called Meridian AI, which will save Crestfield from financial collapse. In the weeks that follow, Sloane works tirelessly to fix the broken culture from within. She quietly investigates the toxic bias practices that have infected the company for years, especially the gatekeeping that kept women and people of color out of leadership. She identifies talent buried in low-level departments, elevates promising voices like Layla, a brilliant analyst, and dismantles the insular power networks that allowed people like Tom to thrive. When Tom makes another power play to undermine her, she calls an emergency board vote. With proof of his discrimination, inflated spending, and resistance to progress, he's terminated on the spot. Sloane launches bold initiatives: tech equity grants, HBCU recruitment, mentorship pipelines, Crestfield into a beacon of future-focused leadership. She closes the $100 million deal, secures a historic spike in revenue, and is hailed across the business world as a force of nature. Former critics become silent or loyal. Young women of color across the country start seeing her as a symbol of what's possible. Her mother's words ring loud: "Walk like the floor was laid for you." And Sloane walks into every room now like it was built just for her and for every voice once silenced.